Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and 2025 did not go great for my reading, we shall say, to put it quite simply, and to not complain too much, because it's not really anything worth complaining about. My life was just very, very chaotic and busy throughout most of 2025. I only ended up reading, I believe in total, the end count ended up being right around 25 books in 2025, compared to the 45 books or more that I read each of the 3 previous years. So just looking at things a little bit more broadly, 2025 was slower. I didn't get through as much, and looking back on it, there was not nearly as much of what I read that I was as excited about as any of the past few years have been. So putting this list together was actually a little bit more difficult than I anticipated it being, and because I read, more or less like just about half of what I've read each of the last 3 years, I decided that my year-end list would end up being about half the size as well. We're only talking about 5 books today in my top. To be fair, I have a couple honorable mentions because I always include honorable mentions, so I do technically have a 6th and 7th pick in here, and then I have a couple dishonorable mentions, as I've been wont to do these last couple times, just talking about a couple of the books that I didn't really enjoy as much, just for fits and giggles. So yeah, that is what we're going to be doing today, just as you might have expected. Without wasting any more time at the beginning of this video, let's jump into the list and first talk about my 2 honorable mentions, a couple books that I really enjoyed in 2025, but that I didn't really feel like was like top 5 worthy per se. There's this sort of conception about like what makes the top 10 for the year, and some years it's just like, I really liked that, but like, is that top 10? Sometimes there are books that you read that you really enjoy, but that just don't really have that extra level of spark to them for some reason, but that you still really want to shout out because they were really great. So these are a couple books for that. My first honorable mention is going to be The White Country by Boston Tarrant, a book that only ended up on my radar at all because of an arc. I was actually offered the arc in a review request for this book, and at the time that I got it, I surprisingly actually had the time to fit in a short extra book in there, and I was kind of in a country mood at the time, or not country, a Western literature mood at the time when that happened, so I was like, you know what, let's just go for it. And I really enjoyed The White Country. It was a book that I was a little bit worried about. I felt like it could have been a little bit heavy-handed as far as the more social themes could have been concerned, but it actually handled all of that quite well, and the story itself was pretty enjoyable. I had a really great time with The White Country. Definitely one of the more memorable books of the year. When I look back at the list of books that I read this year, every single time I see The White Country in my list over there, I'm like, yeah, that one was more special than I expected it to be, so I felt like I had to include it in this list, even if it wasn't a top 5 book. Next up is going to be my other honorable mention. That is While Darkness Gathers by Philip Chase, which is super solid. If you like the Adan trilogy, you're going to like this. It is a not quite standalone. It's technically standalone, but it's also a sequel to the Adan trilogy and spoils a lot about the Adan trilogy, but it is short and really quick and, kind of covers some of those themes that the Adan trilogy does, but from a somewhat new vantage and somewhat expanded vantage even, and completes a little bit of that story and the small handful of loose threads that you could argue may have been ended, or rather not ended, with the Adan trilogy. I really loved Adan. I believe Return to Adan was my second favorite book of 2023, so I was really looking forward to whatever Philip put out as a follow-up, and While Darkness Gathers definitely satisfied. Like I said, it was just, it's not top 5, it definitely would have been a top 10 book probably, if I had actually read more books and felt like I had enough to actually include in a top 10 and not feel like I was forcing a couple things into the list unjustified, but just not quite top 5 of the year. It was very nearly there, basically number 6. So I wanted to give it a shout out because I did really enjoy it, and I do think it is super worth reading if you've already enjoyed Adan. So yeah, that is the other honorable mention. But now we're going to cover the first few actual entries on the list, or I suppose the first couple actual entries. And these two, number 4 and 5, are actually somewhat related to each other, and this is going to seem like a stretch until I explain that they're related to each other, because no small part of the reason why I actually put these on the list is because part of what I loved about them was their depth and how much there is to them, and the fact that somebody could read each of these books a lot, like many times, and still not catch everything, where there's a lot that just goes into them being what they are, that is above and beyond, much of anything else. And so number 5 on my list is House of Leaves. And I think anybody who's read this book knows exactly why I say, like, there's a lot of depth and a lot of stuff about this that makes it truly special and unique. This is probably the most unique book that I've ever read personally, and it was a really enjoyable time. I had so much fun with House of Leaves, in spite of some of the more difficult moments and some of the more obtuse moments, and also in spite of Johnny Truant just not being the best throughout the book. Like, there are some moments where he gets a little bit much and he's a little bit harder to actually enjoy, or definitely enjoy within the context of the book. But there's a ton about House of Leaves, what it's doing and how it executes on that is just like really awesome. I mean, the entire conceit of the book is that you have this documentary, basically, that is called the Navidson Record, that is found, and a commentary is made about it, and the commentary has been like broken together and like split apart, and you have a person, Johnny Truant, who is trying to put together the commentary of the Navidson Record. So like a found footage film, but in written form. That in and of itself is a really cool concept, and honestly by itself made House of Leaves worth reading, so it definitely deserves to be on this list. At number 4 is another really deep At number 4 on the list is another pretty deep piece of work that could be read multiple times without catching every little thing, and that is The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. And the reason why you could read this multiple times without catching every little thing is because it's not properly a narrative. The Silmarillion is not a story. It is a collection of bits of history and lore, and some stories within, to be fair, but it is overall like an overview of a broad swath of the history of Middle-earth, in a relatively condensed format with some of those lore and history and stories in there. It's kind of biblical in the sense that, the Bible is like a collection of histories and lore and some other random stuff in there that's like a little bit harder to read, but it's also got some great stories within there, and you can read the Bible so many times and catch new things within it every single time because there's just too much to grasp at once, and there's a degree of that kind of mode of writing that is within the Silmarillion that is like, you could read this multiple times and probably still not catch or remember everything. But I respect this a ton. I really enjoyed it when I finally went into it and restarted it and got through it here right at the very end of the year. This is a late inclusion on the list for sure, but I really liked it, and by itself convinced me that I for sure, absolutely, without doubt and question, need to read more stuff within Middle-earth, not just rereading Lord of the Rings later this year, not just possibly rereading The Hobbit, but rereading the Silmarillion itself, and also reading more of the other, like, history of Middle-earth stuff, and whatever other volumes, like the Great Tales down there, and The Fall of Numenor, which is part of what's in The Fall of Numenor is also in the Silmarillion, but it also collects all the other random Second Age writings from other different stuff. But, like, Silmarillion just convinced me that I need to read more Middle-earth, and I really want to, so, it gets props for managing to do that. Next up, however, we're going to talk about a couple dishonorable mentions. These are a couple books that, like, really disappointed me a lot. Not necessarily that I hate either one of these, because one of them I think is still a fine book for the most part, despite its problems, and the other one has some really great moments in it, despite my personal issues with it, and maybe some of my personal issues with it are on account of translation rather than the actual work itself, but these two books definitely disappointed me a ton. My first honorable mention is going to be Winter's Heart by Robert Jordan, the 9th book of the Wheel of Time, and the main reason that this is my dishonorable mention, even though I read through all of books 7 through 11 this year, somebody might be like, you're not putting Path of Daggers here, or Crossroads of Twilight? No, I'm not, because Path of Daggers was actually a lot of fun despite its climax having problems, and Crossroads of Twilight, if you know that it is just a bridge book in between Winter's Heart and Knife of Dreams going into it, and that's what you're expecting it to be, it's actually more or less fine. It's very bloated, but more or less fine on its own. Winter's Heart, however, the entire first half of it is actually a genuine slog to get through. There's a lot of issues with the first half of Winter's Heart that made it pretty unenjoyable. And the back half of it, in my opinion, is pretty overrated. People talk about the back half of Winter's Heart being one of the better moments of the series, and I think that it is overrated in the context of people were, a little disappointed with Path of Daggers and the first half of Winter's Heart, and so the back half of this was like a little bit better, and so they hyped that up to be like this really great thing. And to be fair, the main climax of the book is a really big moment for the series. It's a really big, impactful, and important moment for the series. I just wasn't into what Robert Jordan was doing with that climax, and the other major storyline that has a climactic moment like stops halfway through the climax. It's kind of like The Wastelands by Stephen King, another situation where it's just like, well, you're still in the middle of doing this scene. Why did you stop that scene there? This is stupid. It makes no sense. So I think the back half of this is overrated, and I did not like the first half very much. So it disappointed me a lot, especially in context of the slog. It is my least favorite book of the Wheel of Time up to this point, and so it deserves to be a dishonorable mention, because when you expect it to be the best of that like 5-book leg from book 7 through 11, or at least like 7 through 10 anyway, because people tend to quite like book 11. When you expect it to be a little bit better than that, yeah, it disappointed me. The other book that really, really disappointed me, this one I hate actually making a dishonorable mention, but like it is The Aeneid by Virgil. And to be fair, and this is what I said in my review of this and when I covered it early in 2025, is I think part of the blame for this is Robert Fagles' translation. I can't be certain of that, but I have a sneaking suspicion that that's part of it. Now, part of my issue with the Aeneid is like structure and pacing of it, where parts of it just kind of don't really fully satisfy. I think a lot of the books within the Aeneid are just too long. There's only 12 books, and each of them are like well over 1,000 lines long, and I think it would have been better if it was split like the Homeric epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were split into 24 books apiece, and very rarely did either of those have books that went over 1,000 lines. The Iliad had a few of them that did that, but for the most part, those books were a little bit shorter, and so it like flowed a little bit better. And most of the Aeneid only has these 12 books, and most of those 12 books have like 2 parts to them. So like the structure and pacing of a lot of things just felt off to me. There are a couple really, really good books in the Aeneid, don't get me wrong. There were moments of it that I really enjoyed. For example, Book 2, which is actually the Trojan horse story, because you would think those occur in Homer, and they do not. They occur in here. That story is great. There are also a couple other really great books in the Aeneid. The problem is that, like I said, there's like some really weird structural and pacing issues that I personally had with it, which I think is a little bit more fundamental to the actual story itself, and probably comes down to the fact that Virgil died before he actually had a chance to revise this, because he would have revised it. So I want to assume that maybe some of those problems could hypothetically have been fixed, but there's obviously no way to know for sure if that is a thing. But my other major issue with the Aeneid was that Robert Fagles' prose with regard to actually translating the poetry was not good. It was not beautiful. When I'm reading poetry, even epic poetry like of this sort, I expect some aspect of the reading experience to excite me to some degree. After reading Peter Green's translations of Homer, I kind of expected for some amount of beauty to strike me while reading this, and it just did not. There was, I think, like maybe 1 or 2 lines in this entire thing that actually stuck out to me. It was like, yes, more of that, please. But the rest of it was just so unenjoyable to read, so unexciting to read. It's like baby's first translation. I don't know if that's a Robert Fagles thing broadly speaking, because I haven't read his Homer, for example, so I don't know how his Homer reads in comparison. I don't know if this is just a problem with his translation of this, or if it's this book in general and not his translation at all, or if it's him. I don't know for sure, but I just know that I did not enjoy the actual reading experience, and combined with some of my issues on the book, more broadly speaking, like the tone and the structure and stuff like that. Like I said, it was just a huge disappointment. When I loved the Iliad and the Odyssey so much, so much, the fact that I came out of the Aeneid just like not having had a great time was really, really disappointing to me. But now we're going to jump into the top 3 books, my 3 favorite reads of 2025. Let's just jump right into it. One of these is Stephen King's The Dead Zone, a book that surprised me a lot, but that I really, 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 really loved. I plowed through this in like barely a week. It's one of those books that I think the further that I get into Stephen King's bibliography, particularly while I'm reading this early era of his stuff, you know, these first couple decades of his work, I'm probably going to be shouting The Dead Zone from the rooftops as one of those books that people don't talk about enough in the context of his early career, because it is up there with some of the other great stuff in his career, even though it's not really horror the way that a lot of his other early career work is. It's still got some supernatural stuff going on, but it is very character focused, but I really, really like this. I could see some people being pretty disappointed by the ending, but honestly, by the time you're 2/3 of the way through the book, you know where the book is going on a plot perspective, so the ending shouldn't actually surprise you that much, and therefore, I mean, maybe if you just don't like it, that's fine, but like I think that if people were saying they're disappointed by the ending, or they didn't see it coming or something, that would be a weird critique. I don't know if that's a critique that's actually made. I just know that this was a good Stephen King book, a really good one, and the ending was also pretty solid. You know, I gave this a 4.5 star and rounded that up to 5, where, like, you know, the ending, the last third of it was what kind of dropped the book by a 1/2 star, but I enjoyed so much of the book so much that I had to give it the round up, because the ending wasn't bad. You know, it was just maybe a little bit tonally more dismal than I would have liked, for example. It's not a happy ending, but it's still a good ending. That's the issue. But anyway, I really loved The Dead Zone. This was a surprise hit for me this year. I wasn't thinking this was going to be a top 3 book, but then I was like kind of compiling things together. I'm like, no, I really, really liked The Dead Zone, especially after I came out reading the Firestarter more recently and realized how similar Firestarter and The Dead Zone are, and just how much better The Dead Zone does what it's trying to do than Firestarter does. You know, I came out liking Dead Zone even more because of that, so definitely worthy of being in my personal top 3. My second favorite book of 2025 was another not surprise hit per se. I had this recommended by a friend, and I was pretty confident that I would enjoy it, but I wasn't so certain that I was going to love it, but I did indeed love it. This is Red Rabbit by Alex Grecian. This is like a supernatural horror western story set in a relatively shortly post-Civil War America in the Midwest, and this thing is incredible. I really loved this book. The supernatural ideas, the way that Alex Grecian uses those ideas throughout the story is by itself one of the coolest ideas that I've like experienced reading in a book. Like, it's not that complex or anything like that, but just he did it so well that I really found myself loving it. And I also found myself really enjoying the characters and the plot itself in every regard. The actual journey of the characters, sort of a quasi-found family aspect, not quite that trope the way that you're thinking of it, but there's just a lot of things that Alex Grecian does in here that are like great, and he somehow manages to mix in so many disparate different ideas and make them all work and be satisfying. Like I said, this is like a Western horror, and like it's incredible. It does both the Western and the horror very well, and it does the supernatural aspect of the horror stuff really interestingly and in a way that really caught my attention, and it stuck with me. I can't remember how early I read this book. I read this book back in February. That's a lot earlier than I thought it was. I thought it was like March or April, but I guess it makes sense that it was February. And this was the one book I think that stuck in my mind positively the entire year, where people asked You know, like, what are your favorite books of 2025 so far at various different points in the year? And this was always one of the ones that I pointed out, was just like, this is the one that really stuck out to me. I think when I came back from a content hiatus in July this year, because I took June off from posting any content, I did like a top 5 books of the year so far or something like that. And I'm 99% sure that Red Rabbit was number 1 in that top 5 books of the year so far. Actually, that's a lie. It wouldn't have been top 5 books of the year so far, because I would have read another book that would have actually been included in that list. But even so, Red Rabbit has, since I read it, been one of those books that I've looked back on and been like, that was a really special book for me. I know one person or a couple people that weren't super into it, but most everybody else I know who's read it really like it, so I recommend it. But that takes us into number 1, and of course, you actually have seen it in this video the entire time, because I've been tricking you, making you think that maybe I wasn't going to talk about it, even though everybody knows that I was. Of course, it's Shadows Upon Time by Christopher Ruocchio, and I do have to preface that, like, I am sort of biased on this in that I've worked for Ruocchio in the past, and I have done various different other jobs for him at this point, and pretty soon at this point, actually, I can go ahead and say that we're actually in the process of hiring me to be a full-time assistant for Ruocchio and his business, so I do have that bias, and I also have the bias of being a friend of Christopher's at this point for a little while, so, like, if you don't trust my opinion on this, I totally understand. Like, I'm not going to hold that against you at all. But Shadows Upon Time is definitely the best book, my favorite book that I read in 2025. It's not really a surprise that that was the thing. I got to read this like 5 months ahead of time. I was one of the first probably dozen or so people to get to read it. And I loved it. I really, really loved it. You know, in a year where I've just had so much chaos and been so busy and not had much reading time, I was able to get through Shadows Upon Time, which is not a small book at all. This thing is a big book, and I managed to get through this in 2 weeks. Like, I don't read books this big this quickly, but I managed to read it in 2 weeks, and it was incredible. You know, being able to read this and then reading The Dead Zone literally right afterwards, having 2 of my top 3 books of the year back to back there in June was awesome. And Shadows Upon Time was just an incredibly memorable experience, closing The Sun Eater, which is my favorite series. And now that I'm in this process of actually in the process of hiring to work for the Ruocchios full time, it's a very surreal thing just how much Sun Eater has impacted my life. It's no surprise that this is my number 1. I understand if people think that I'm too biased to be able to, like, legitimately say that it's my number 1 without it feeling fake or hammed up or something like that, but it really is my favorite. I loved Shadows Upon Time. It was great. I'm not 100% sure at this point if it is my favorite in the series. Ashes of Man might still be my favorite, but at this point I've more or less, you know, declined from actually saying how I rank the series at this point. I haven't done a full Sun Eater series ranking yet since finishing the book, because I need to get through rereading the rest of the books before I know, because I've read the first couple books a few times. I know how I feel about those very strongly, but as far as books, like especially 5, 6, and 7 go, I mean, particularly 5. The reason why I'm not willing to make a ranking at this point is because I don't remember Ashes of Man very much. It's my favorite one, but I read that so quickly and was in such a haze that I don't actually remember very much of Ashes of Man, so I definitely need to be fair and give more of these books a deeper reread, which I'm going to be doing over the course of the future. Part of the work that I'm going to do for Christopher when I'm working for him is going to be editorial stuff for, you know, the special editions of these books like I've been doing. So when I come through and I've reread most of the rest of the series, especially once I've gotten through Ashes of Man, I think by the time I've reread that, I'll know one way or the other how I feel. At that point, I'll be able to rank the series, but I think I can say that this is tied with Ashes of Man for my favorite at this point, whereas Howling Dark used to be tied with Ashes of Man for my favorite. I do like this one a little bit better than Howling Dark, so that much I can say. But yeah, that is my top 5 books, plus a couple honorable mentions and dishonorable mentions for 2025. Let me know how your reading year went. I certainly hope it went better for you guys than it went for me, and I hope that you guys had a great time with your books. What are some of your favorites? What are some of the ones that you didn't like very much, ironically enough? Let me know in the comments below. I would sure be interested to hear about it. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC. Keep an eye out on the next couple Thursday episodes of the Book Binge, where I'll be doing a tier list for all of the books that I read in 2025, just like I did for the previous couple years of reading, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys there. I certainly hope to see you guys in the next video.